The darkness was closing in. I was on my 4th day of walking across America on the American Discovery Trail. I was in Lexington, Indiana. Don't worry about how it was my 4th day on a transcontinental walk and I was in Indiana. Not confused about American geography, but we won't get in the weeds right now, it's beside the point. I was in Lexington, Indiana, and I was preparing for a pivotal moment in my walk. After spending the first 3 nights in paid accommodation, a hotel, a campground, and a lodge, I was finally going to free camp somewhere. Veterans on this route had made the process sound easy. Just find a likely house, knock on the door, smile and tell them your story, and sweetly ask if you can camp in the corner of their yard. Odds are, they said, they'll not only give you a patch of lawn, but they might open their home, giving you a couch to sleep on, a hot meal, some convivial conversation. So that was my expectation. I started looking for homes with multiple cars parked outside. I approached the first and knocked on the door. No answer. I walked on a bit, found another, knocked again. Crickets. Discouraged, I carried on down the road when luck struck. A car pulled into the driveway just ahead. I came to the end of the driveway, maintained a polite distance, and tried to look as inoffensive and unthreatening as I can, and I acknowledge my limitations there. The person did not immediately get out of their car. So I waited. You know, sometimes you're listening to a song in your car and you can't get out till it's over. They remained in the car. So I waited. You know, sometimes there's a phone call wrapping up and it's easier to just stay in the car and finish it. So I waited. Well, they were still in that car. So I got the message and I set off down the road. Before I was even 50 meters further on, bang! There was a gunshot. I whirled around, birds were exploding in the trees overhead. And there that person was on their deck outside their front door. Now, given that I commonly saw signs warning that due to the rising cost of ammunition, there won't be a warning shot, I suppose I have to be appreciative of the courtesy. A short while later, a police officer drove up to me. So yes, technically I have been pulled over by a cop while walking. He asked for my ID. I explained that I was walking across the United States and looking for a place to sleep. He told me someone in the neighborhood had called the police out of fear that I was trying to prey on elderly residents. He told me it's not against the law to knock on doors, no problem there, so I wasn't in any trouble. But he suggested I look for churches and cemeteries to sleep in. Later that night, just before darkness had settled in fully, my luck finally turned. A man was working on his truck in his driveway, Vietnam veteran. He welcomed me into his yard with almost casual indifference, offered me some hot dogs and bottled water, and then I quickly settled into my bivvy for the night, relieved to have the process over with. My point is this: finding your rhythm is hard when you set out on a journey, and it's even harder to find your rhythm when you're alone. The original title that I suggested for this presentation many months ago was "The Rhythm Is Not Yours," period. Tom Coleman suggested adding alone to the end, and some stuff before, and I think that was prudent and fair and probably accurate to boot. Now that a presentation actually exists to accompany the title, I kind of find myself drawn back to that blunter, maybe more provocative, but also maybe more honest version. Let me explain. First, some acknowledgments. I'm not here to be dogmatic. I'm not here to throw stones. Here's my glass house. I make reservations often when I'm on pilgrimage. I wear headphones when walking. Sometimes for many hours. I love listening to audiobooks when I walk. I occasionally stay in private rooms. These days, I usually carry a laptop. It's like minus 100 pilgrim points right there. Someday I will need to ship my bag, and when that time comes, I will gladly ship my bag if that's what it takes to keep going on pilgrimage. I am going to talk today about the value of testing our limits and pushing out of our comfort zone on pilgrimage, but I am not here to define what that means. I don't know where your limit is, nor what your comfort zone looks like. So I'm not interested in orthodoxy, but rather some general principles. And as I proceed, predictably maybe, I want to note that I'm thinking about this whole conversation through the lens of punk rock. Here's why. I grew up in punk rock, playing in bands, going to shows, being involved in activism and all the other DIY activities that are central to the realm. And punk rock and the Camino pilgrimage community is the two subcultures that I have been most deeply invested in different parts of my life. They actually have some striking similarities. On one hand, you have a consistent onboarding of new, excited, nervous people who come in looking to learn the ground rules while also bringing their own expectations and assumptions, along with whatever the current baggage is from the dominant culture. And on the other, you have a dwindling group of old-timers, sometimes becoming fatigued by the newbies, sometimes bemoaning a sense of loss or a growing belief that traditions aren't being appropriately valued or predicted or protected. In punk, the biggest criticism was saved for those who seemed to be adopting the aesthetics without the substance. That is, coming in for the fashion or some fun shows or just to be provocative, flashing the middle finger towards society at large without actually becoming invested in politics or activism or other important communal expectations. There was a sense that they were cheapening or co-opting what made punk special. And maybe you can see the parallel to the Camino. You know, the Camino, like punk rock, is countercultural in many ways, and has probably become all the more so over the last couple of decades. That makes it intriguing to many outsiders, and that also makes it uncomfortable to many of the same people. Those of us in this room are not a representative sample. Whether you're new or old to the Camino, there's a level of investment and also resources that are necessary to bring us here. My inference is that many in this room are not merely pilgrims, but also trailblazers and wayfinders and shepherds, all of the people who were just acknowledged a moment ago, shepherds, all. And that we're looking for ways to do all of those things better. And so I think the challenge we face is figuring out how to do all that, how to spotlight and celebrate and preserve the things we value most about the Camino and pilgrimage, without, in the process, becoming gatekeepers. And that's my big question for all of us in this room. So let's come back to this. The rhythm is not yours, period. And just so we're clear, it's not mine either. I am nervous about the frequent emphasis in Camino discourse about this being your Camino, about you do you, about this possessive individual claim on the Camino. I'm mindful of Dan Mullen's excellent and staggeringly prolific podcast, My Camino, and I don't want to be misunderstood. I understand the language in that context, looking backward at a discrete experience that lives on in our memory and the story we construct about it. And I recognize too that there are good, important points lurking in that phrasing. It's important to walk the right distances and the right pace for you, that's fair. But that forward-looking focus on what your Camino will be, that emphasis in the present on my Camino as I walk through the stages, I think that's concerning. And look, I know. The dude from Portland, Oregon is coming down to Texas to talk about pronouns. I know, it's a little on the nose. They give me a chance here. We are living during a period of peak individualism in many ways. And I think it's feeding that mindset. I'll talk more about it later. But the Camino is a deeply communal experience. Part of its power lies in the shared human tradition and experience of pilgrimage, following in the footsteps of so many who preceded us, who walk alongside us, who will follow us in the years to come. And in the process of becoming pilgrims, it behooves us to learn from the wisdom of those who have paved the way, who we join as peers, and to approach this with humility and curiosity. In other words, it is our Camino, and instead of starting it new, we are joining it midstream. At the same time, we Americans need to think of ourselves as guests. I am doubly an outsider, neither Spanish nor Catholic. And that is to say, I and we need to be cognizant of how it's also their Camino. The first reason I want to argue that it's better to think theirs and ours than mine and yours is that we are chronically wrong when it comes to thinking about what we actually want, what we believe will make us happier. We have the field of positive psychology to thank for clarifying this for us over the last few decades. And I have an example here. I recognize this first example won't work particularly well with this crowd. Which of these comparably priced things do you think will make you happier? Okay. Here's what I want you to know. Y'all are weird, okay? In studies, people forecast being twice as happy with a material purchase as they expect they would be with the price of an experience. You can see a certain logic running through that the television will last longer in certain ways than the duration of the trip. But you know better. Research confirms your expectations. We anticipate trips 2.5 times more than we anticipate objects, so it's better on the front end. Post-consumption ratings are higher for trips as well. It's better afterward. We enjoy it more. Also important, experiences are less prone to social comparison. If you've ever got a car and then your friend gets a car but it looks nicer and now you hate your crappy car. We do this with material objects all the time, social comparison. And it brings along disappointment with it. And incidentally, there are other benefits to traveling instead of buying material objects. Your friends will find you twice as humorous if you invest in experiences. The research proves it. And they will also see you as more psychologically well-adjusted and interesting. Probably because you are. So people in this room aside, we tend to engage as humans in this wanting, seeking things for ourselves with the belief that they will make us happy, only for them to accomplish nothing of the sort. The cause of this letdown in many cases is something called hedonic adaptation, where we get like a 2-week sugar rush of happiness, and then the thrill is gone. We go right back to the baseline. That toy you wanted for your birthday for months that was forgotten under the bed a week after you got it. I find myself wondering, though, if the Camino can creep, or if it might be creeping in some cases, towards being more of a product and less of an experience. A bucket list item that you buy as a package deal designed for efficiency, simplicity, and comfort. And to be clear, that's not to disparage people who make those choices, but to question if it comes at a cost beyond the price tag. All too often, what we believe aligns with what we want, what we believe will make us happiest, falls short of that. Our happiness predictors malfunction at a worryingly high rate. And that makes life complicated. We understandably want to attend to the needs of the self, to my needs, to your needs. There's a reason the self-help industry is booming, right? And yet the efficacy of many of those efforts is questionable. I've been influenced by this book, Lost Connections by Johann Hari, and in it he explores the alarmingly high rates of depression, anxiety, and loneliness today. It's true for all of us. I work with high schoolers. It's at dangerous levels with high schoolers. This is a personal story for Hari. He spent years and years on antidepressants and finally wanted to get to the root of the issues involved, so he met with dozens of experts in pursuit of answers, wrote this book. This is what he discovered. I thought there was something wrong with the self, and the solution would come from repairing and aggrandizing the self. But it turns out the self isn't the solution. The only answer lies beyond it. That answer lies beyond the self. I want you to pause for a second and think of the most transformative, harmonious, magical moment you had on the Camino. Maybe it was the moment setting down a stone among so many other stones left by so many other pilgrims at the Cruz de Ferro. Maybe it was watching the sunset in Finisterre or Muxia, surrounded by other pilgrims at the end of their journey. Maybe it was just walking through the sunlight, coming down through the stained glass in the Cathedral of Leon or one of the other churches and cathedrals along the way as other pilgrims strolled and took it all in. Or watching the boat of Fumero swing overhead, packed in like sardines in the pews in Santiago. Or a pilgrim dinner, a communal meal in Horizon, Gragnon, or any of the other legendary or not so legendary places along the way. Maybe it was getting lost in conversation for hours with a pilgrim you just met, or feeling your body respond with a strength you never knew you had as you climbed yet another hill, or having a host care for you in a moment of need. In any of those moments, in all of those moments, you probably felt many things. But I would offer that more than anything, you likely felt awe. Dr. Keltner is the foremost expert in the United States on the emerging field of awe. He's written this book about it, tons of stuff published over the last couple of decades. And he defines awe as the feeling of being in the presence of something vast that transcends your current understanding of the world. But what I find more useful is his breakdown of the different kinds of awe. He's identified 8. So we experience awe in nature. Think about those feelings you have crossing the Pyrenees, or when the Meseta unfolds around you, or a Osabrero if you are lucky enough to have a view through the fog for a couple of seconds. Think about music, that experience of singing along with other people, swaying together. Spiritual or religious experiences, ritual and worship joined together in chant, in song. The collective experiences, weddings and funerals, sporting events even, those situations where we are brought together in human company. Visual design, that effect that human creativity can have on us when we see something marvelous. Moral beauty, when someone does something so noble, so genuine, so kind, it stops us in our tracks. The example that I always use is the 2 cross-country runners neck and neck down towards the finish line. One wipes out, sprains his ankle. And instead of charging on to victory, the other one goes back, lifts him up, helps him cross the finish line. A marvelous thing to behold. Witnessing birth and particularly peaceful passage into death. And epiphanies where we see things as they are. All of those are distinct forms of awe. And looking back at these 8, I mean, how many of them do we potentially encounter on Camino on a daily basis? Pilgrimage is an awe-rich environment. And that's all the more noteworthy given the benefits of awe, which we're only just beginning to understand. Here's just a glimpse of what we've learned. Awe supports healing, lowers stress, and increases well-being. It's especially powerful among vulnerable groups like people carrying trauma. It's an incredible healer. Have any of you ever felt busy? Maybe at some point in your life, a little bit busy, maybe? Yeah, you're laughing because you probably feel busy all the time, or you have at certain points. And you may well have been busy. But often when we feel busy, it's just that, a feeling. Researchers call it the time crunch. Awe has the ability to help us escape the time crunch. That is to say, awe makes it easier for us to be present in the moment and not stressed about later. Awe is also shown to inspire social cohesion and pro-social values. It brings us together, it galvanizes us, it makes us feel more connected to one another. It even reduces materialism, right? There's a reason you don't want that television anymore. Opening the door for each of us to cultivate new perspectives on our purpose and meaning in life. Yang Bai calls awe the quintessential collective emotion, and notes that it leads the individual to become part of something bigger than the self. It integrates the individual into the collective, much like the Camino. Awe is a reminder that it is our Camino. And awe leads me to flow. The idea of flow states comes from research performed by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and he defines them as the state in which people are so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. The experience itself is so enjoyable that people will do it, even at great cost. This is also known as being in the zone. Flow states occur under specific conditions. First, they occur with tasks we have a chance of completing, not a guarantee. If it's too easy, the mind can wander around all kinds of things. If it's too hard, it dominates our focus. It has to be just hard enough. And ideally, it requires all of our relevant skills. To get in the flow, we have to be able to concentrate on what we're doing. And as we get into that flow state, we are able to act with deep and effortless involvement that removes thoughts of everyday life. To sustain that flow state, the task must have clear goals and provide immediate feedback. And in the process, it allows one to exercise control over their actions while time just slips by. Now, maybe the effortless involvement part doesn't remind you of parts of your Camino. There's some very effortful involvement on those climbs to Horizon and Osoburo. And Csikszentmihalyi High acknowledges that flow states are not necessarily pleasant in the moment. But I suspect most of that does feel like the Camino. And what flow states offer is a seemingly paradoxical impact on the self. When you are in the zone, concern for the self disappears. We stop dwelling on the many different things we dwell upon that we perseverate over. We forget about what happened yesterday. We stop worrying about tomorrow. We just flow. And yet, what emerges from this is a stronger sense of self, bolstered by this experience. How many of you were amazed at yourself over the course of your Camino? At your body's resilience, at what you were capable of, things you never realized you were capable of. The self emerges stronger. The answer lies beyond the self. Only by not focusing on it do we strengthen it in this regard. And eliminating challenge is not likely to get us there. Flow is about finding that line, just challenging enough to keep us fully engaged without overwhelming us. We need that challenge if we are to grow. And I recognize it can be hard to face that challenge head on. Two of the most paralyzing words in the English language can come hurtling at us when we confront something new or intimidating or alien. I can think of so many fears that I have encountered over the course of my life. I vividly remember being scared as a kid about getting my driver's license. Maybe some of you had similar feelings. I was so focused on the risk that it was challenging for me to consider the possibilities, the world that would open up for me afterward. You know, I remember when my last student group was approaching the end of our pilgrimage a few years ago. We followed the Via Podiensis from Le Puy-en-Velay to Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, and 2 days remained. We would cross the Pyrenees to Roncesvalles, and then for our last day, continue on all the way to Pamplona. 2 hardest days of the walk for us. Students were nervous. They spent days before we arrived wondering how they would manage, if they would make it. And I also vividly remember when I walked from Lamar, Colorado to the outskirts of Las Animas on a hot and dry September day. And though I say Colorado, let's be clear here, we're talking about eastern Colorado, which is actually western Kansas. And the sun was baking down. A relentless wind was blowing squarely in my face throughout the day. And my last water point came up dry, and I powered, and then I marched, and then I stumbled, and then I finally staggered 40 miles into Bedford Inn, desiccated and practically crashing onto the front desk. There were multiple points in the home stretch of that walk when I wondered if I would find myself face planted on the side of the road. But for all that, my biggest fear came when they told me the on-site restaurant was closed. The only other food options were 2 miles away in central Las Animas. I nearly fainted in the hallway, not exaggerating, like almost keeled over first time in my life as I trudged to my room. So we all have fears. You know, if I went around the room, I suspect you would all have equally vivid memories of the what-if scenarios that haunted you before you finally set forth on the Camino. But, you know, we learn in time that the cure for what if is little more than well then. And we also learn that the best stories begin with what if. Nobody wants to hear a story where everything goes perfectly smoothly. Nobody wants to tell that story. We want stories of overcoming adversity, of navigating challenges, of embracing setbacks and coming out on top. What if is where the good stuff happens. One of the biggest things we learn on the Camino is that we can surmount our fears instead of avoiding them. It's a genuinely safe place to fail. We don't have a lot of those. We need them. When I was nervous about driving, I stopped and looked around. I had peers at school who, from my 15-year-old vantage point, were, shall we say, unimpressive. And it occurred to me that if they could manage an automobile, I had a good chance. So those who preceded me cleared the way for me, however unintentionally. And on the Camino too, I found confidence in those who had braved the route before me, who had shown that it was possible, that it could be done, that even the hardest days would become badges of honor. That was a role I could play for my students as well, meeting their anxiety with confidence, with the voice of experience. And on that day when we crossed the Pyrenees, the rhythm was ours as well. Sometimes, of course, what if does lead to oh no. Even in my lowest moments, though, I have been amazed by how a way forward appears. That Vietnam veteran in Lexington, Indiana, who let me pitch my tent. The innkeeper at the Bent Fort Inn, worrying about my well-being, and rightly so, checked on me 10 minutes after I collapsed into bed, and then roped her husband to drive me 2 miles to a Dairy Queen for dinner. When I've been in greatest need on the Camino, when walking in this country, that need has been met with kindness. How can we ever build trust if we are never vulnerable, never in need? One of the things I wonder about, though, is whether new pilgrims today might be psyched out by the more abundant supports. When you come into this new and see lots of posts and advertisements for tours and booking services and baggage transport and the many other comforts and conveniences and amenities today, all of them valid, is there a risk that this feeds your doubts or limits your imagination of what's possible? Not knowing any different, if I came to the Camino today instead of 20 years ago, would I have gravitated towards the Follow the Caminos and Max Adventures and Santiago Ways of the world, simply because that seemed to be normal protocol, and because it felt a lot more comfortable and safe than finding my own way? Again, to reach that flow state, appropriate challenge is necessary. In education, we talk about the zone of proximal development, that learning happens when we are pushed beyond our immediate comfort zone, but not like way out of it. But when comfort is available and security is part of the package, it is really tempting to embrace that, to not even consider alternatives. It's tempting to assume that it's easier to be a new pilgrim today than it was 20 years ago. There are YouTube videos and bronze and tons of accommodation options and great guidebooks and apps and routes to suit every desire and baggage transport and restaurants that appeal to foreign tastes and dietary habits. But I've started to wonder if maybe it's harder.
Yeah.
In his book, The Paradox of Choice, Barry Schwartz highlights the beauty of constraint. As he writes, the part of the downside of abundant choice is that each new option adds to the list of trade-offs. And trade-offs have psychological consequences. The necessity of making trade-offs alters how we feel about the decisions we face. More important, it affects the level of satisfaction we experience from the decisions we ultimately make. To put it another way, the more choices we have, the less satisfied we tend to be. To come at this from another angle, consider this line from Proust. At this moment in Swann's Way, he describes when the narrator's mother hopes to speak with Swann about his daughter, but is prevented from doing so by the presence of an intruder. And here's how he explains it. My mother had to abandon the request, but managed to extract from the restriction itself a further refinement of thought, as great poets do when the tyranny of rhyme forces them into the discovery of their finest lines. The tyranny of rhyme. Instead of destroying the opportunity, the limitation sparked a new measure of creativity. Choices can bring dissatisfaction, constraint can inspire creativity and possibility. In how many ways does the constraint of the Camino liberate us? Wearing the same 2 or 3 shirts for a month, eating the same salad or tortilla for the 4th time in a week, the same café con leche every morning, 2 or 3 times. Why do I struggle to find something to eat for dinner in a giant American supermarket, but I'm at ease in a small grocery in Spain? And we have an idea that options will bring happiness, that choice will satisfy, that customizability will optimize the experience. And yet, it can be hard to settle into a rhythm when we are dwelling on endless possibilities. And I wonder sometimes if new pilgrims today are just overwhelmed by it all. I need to pause at this point and issue a warning. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna discuss the tourist and pilgrim labels. If you need to go running, screaming out of the building right now, I understand. I won't hold it against you. No subject generates more heat in pilgrim circles. We're at the point where the Camino Forum has banned this topic from discussion entirely. I avoid similar posts in Facebook groups. There's rarely a goal to pursue understanding. It's mostly flame wars. But I admit I got sucked into a thread a few months back, just as a lurker, not as a poster. When I saw someone take issue with the old pilgrimage saying that tourists demand and pilgrims are grateful. How dare you be judgmental, the poster declared. What is the point of these labels? They only serve to divide. And I understand the sensitivity, but I take issue with the critique of language. These are different words. They have different meanings, and those meanings matter. Instead of an implied insult, could we encourage new pilgrims to see the distinction as a growth opportunity and approach it with openness and enthusiasm? Because here's the thing. When I decided to embark on the Camino the first time, I had one thought clear in my mind. I didn't want to be a tourist. We have all been tourists. Some of us will be tourists in San Antonio when we're done here. We all know what it can mean to be a tourist. And maybe this is more being a bad tourist, but I'm just folding it all under tourist. Seeking enjoyment, comfort, maybe even a little luxury. In that quest for self-indulgence, we can sometimes not be the best versions of ourselves. There's a reason the ugly American stereotype exists. So what does it mean to become a pilgrim? And why is that a transformation worth making? I wanted to be a pilgrim. Instead of days filled with sightseeing, I wanted to be immersed in history and tradition. I wanted fulfilling and exhausting daily labor that was embedded in community and culture. I wanted to grow in some very concrete ways. I wasn't satisfied with who I was. I saw pilgrimage as possibility. That distinction between tourist and pilgrim mattered to me. It matters to me. Now, I've looked at a lot of different definitions of pilgrim over the years. One of the simplest and most useful is journey plus intention. We set out with a goal or a purpose or a notion, some objective that elevates it beyond just a walk. So pilgrimage at its core, really, I think, is about intention. The journey within and without happening simultaneously. I have a vivid memory from my first Camino. I arrived in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port at night under the cover of darkness on the last train from Bayonne. Followed a handful of pilgrims to the pilgrim office, checked into the municipal refuge, was escorted into a dark room filled with sleeping pilgrims, and quickly dropped into my sleeping bag. When my eyes opened, it was time to walk. Before I knew it, I was crossing the Pyrenees. That day kicked my butt. I was not physically prepared, but I was young, and that helped. I walked too quickly. I arrived in Roncesvalles ahead of most. I just wanted to lie down. The albergue wouldn't open for a couple hours still, so I popped into La Posada and got a room. You could just walk in those days. There was a vacancy. I slept through the day, the night, got started after most pilgrims had already left the following morning. I powered ahead, at one point passing a long chain of pilgrims on an uphill stretch, barely a buen Camino exchanged. I was alone. I was a little disoriented, but I was damn well going to get wherever I was going fast. And even with all that, by the time I arrived in La Rosoaña, the municipal albergue, the only game in town at that point, already had its 8 beds filled up. I grabbed one of the last 2 empty canvas potato bags on the floor and counted myself lucky. Others were forced to taxi ahead to Pamplona. It was a terrible night. I couldn't get comfortable, twisting and turning on the hard floor. Some older French pilgrims introduced me to the true meaning of snoring. I hated it. Like, there's no rosy glow and nostalgia settling in over those moments. I was miserable. And so the next night, I retreated into the warm embrace of a private hotel room. And as I lounged in a moderately comfortable bed that afternoon, I was ashamed of myself. You see, I was on a pilgrimage. I had set an intention. I was going on pilgrimage to live in community, to be more sociable, to push myself to connect with others in a way I never had. I knew this would be uncomfortable. I knew it would be downright unpleasant at times. But the person I wanted to be needed to be stretched. And this was the way I would do it. And yet, just a few days in, I was settling for safety and comfort as often as not, and I could see myself trending in the wrong direction. I had to be brutally honest with myself and to recommit. And I did. You know, it's funny. If today it's your Camino is a commonplace mantra, if you go back a couple decades, you would have been more likely to hear Vale la pena. It is worth the pain. That notion, for me, aligns with the original meaning of the word sacrifice, which is to make sacred. You know, in a way, the hardness is the point. Not a gratuitous suffering like wearing shoes a size too small or walking for miles with a pebble under your heel, but the challenge you can manage, the hill you can climb, the version of you that you knew was waiting to make it out. The change that is made possible through intention and dedication. And to be clear, the challenge doesn't even have to be physical. For me, on that first Camino, it was social. Interestingly, one of the most common pieces of advice offered to new pilgrims today is to avoid setting expectations. And to be clear, this is good advice. Here's Schwartz again. When asked about what they regret most in the last 6 months, people tend to identify actions that didn't meet expectations. And that rings true. The pilgrim who sets forth on the Camino expecting to have a Camino family ready-made in Horizon, or to find their soulmate somewhere in the Meseta, or to have an epiphany on the Cruz de Ferro is likely setting themselves up for disappointment. It made me wonder, though, what is the difference between intention and expectation? On the surface, they feel similar. How can one be essential to pilgrimage and the other a trap? Ultimately, you know, I think that the distinction is just in those first 2 letters. Intentions point inward. They speak to how we live in the world, the approach we take. Expectations point outward, to how we hope the world will conform to us, and our interests and our needs. What's striking to me about that Schwartz quote is what follows. When asked about what they regret most when they look back on their lives as a whole, not just 6 months later, their lives as a whole, people tend to identify failures to act. So certainly we're disappointed when our expectations are unfulfilled. But the most lasting regrets come from our failed intentions, when we fail to manifest as the people we aspire to be. I set forth on the Camino thinking that I could independently march my way to personal change, carrying some mixture of misplaced confidence and overwhelming insecurity. Only after I settled in, committed to the albergues, started spending time on the trail with other pilgrims, did I finally begin to grow. Because the rhythm was not mine. I only found it in communion. I look back on what I was carrying in those days, and I wonder too about what all of us Americans are carrying on the Camino. It's worth noting up front that even acknowledging the whole ugly American stereotype, most of the hospitaleros I have spoken with over the years say that they love having Americans. Americans overwhelmingly tend to be good guests. We bring positive energy, generally convey gratitude and appreciation. Many of us are doing a lot of things really well as pilgrims on the Camino. But we also exist within a larger culture, and we internalize that. The acclaimed political scientist Robert Putnam has documented that changing cultural context quite famously in Bowling Alone, and the more recent The Upswing. And the graphs that follow are from his book. So in the United States today, we don't participate in community organizations anymore. General membership has plummeted, as has the attendance rate of those few who remain committed to clubs and organizations. Again, a lot of abnormal people, weirdos in this room. The nuns, N-O-N-E-S, are the largest religious group in America today. Church and temple attendance has dropped precipitously, and as a consequence, we have stopped engaging in those organizations that support a wide range of pro-social behaviors. We don't trust each other. Those people in Lexington, Indiana revealed that clearly. And that's not just the United States, it's most of the world. Perhaps not coincidentally, we don't talk to our neighbors. Most of my students don't know the names of more than one of their neighbors. We don't get married. Young people today have broken the habit, and the total number of married couples has gone off a cliff. There are ways in which there are good parts to this, right? Marriage has had its downsides over the years for a lot of people. But as one data point within this larger whole, it speaks to our national trend towards dissolution, towards atomization. You can even see it in publishing. This one's fascinating. A lexical analysis of the relative prevalence of the words I and we in American books across more than a century. You can go back to 1900 when I was dominant. Gradually over the next 6 decades, we took over, only to relinquish preeminence back to I in the succeeding years. From mine to ours and back again. Another symbol of the rise of individualism. When I was in 10th grade, I starred as the judge in the play Inherit the Wind, the high water mark of my dramatic career. And there's a line in that play that has stuck with me ever since. God created man in his image, and man, being a gentleman, returned the compliment. And I can't help but wonder if, after the Camino and all those associated with it, welcomed us all to be pilgrims in its own image, regardless of our background and beliefs, if we have gradually started to return the compliment, reshaping it in a manner more familiar and comfortable and in line with our own beliefs. With apologies to Tim O'Brien, whose book is awesome, I recognize that baggage is among the laziest of metaphors, but there's some truth to it. We don't just carry clothing and sleeping bags and toiletries. We carry those cultural beliefs and values. We carry that distinct brand of individualism, the lack of trust, the breakdown of community, the expectations of privacy and comfort. We carry the expectation of buying a product as opposed to joining in a collective experience. That doesn't make us bad people. That makes us normal Americans. But can we learn to carry that baggage more lightly on our shoulders, to lighten our load? Can we learn to leave it somewhere on the trail, like a stone at the Cristofero? When we change our context, new possibilities for growth emerge. Think back on the earliest meaning of pilgrim, a stranger in a strange land. When we are immersed in a different culture, we see ourselves differently and we appreciate our home in new ways. This is important. Let's try not to make the Camino too familiar, because it's their Camino. And that's not just a matter of respect, it's also a way of preserving a big part of what makes it special for us. So many of these issues that I have raised, tourists versus pilgrims, embracing challenges, the temptations of comfort, the limitations of it's your Camino, can and do generate nuclear level heat in a Facebook group or discussion forum, but they don't have to. That doesn't have to be an inevitability. It brings me back to this question: how can we be trailblazers and wayfinders and shepherds without becoming gatekeepers? And maybe one answer is by becoming better storytellers and salespeople. Instead of getting frustrated with another tour company question or criticizing someone for using baggage transport or tossing around Torrey-Grino, we can come at this from the other direction. There are possibilities here. Possibilities that do not exist at home. Possibilities that don't exist in our often all too siloed, all too individualized lives. Let us sell people on a vision of how we can grow, change, transform by facing our fears, seeing the beauty in constraint, in overcoming challenges, in exploring a life that is different from what we know, in reducing our focus on our own individual wants, and yes, in lightening our loads, and instead seeing the richness of a life in communion with others, a life of simplicity, courage, and love, because the rhythm is ours. We can find the rhythm when we immerse ourselves in awe, lose ourselves in flow, and activate the smaller self phenomenon, because the rhythm is ours. As Larson and Kleider have shown, hills seem less steep when we approach them with others instead of alone, because the rhythm is ours. And as Wildermuth and Heath have documented, when we sing together, we share more. And when we walk together, we trust and we cooperate and we self-sacrifice more. Because the rhythm is ours. And as Shane O'Mara explains, when we walk in unison, our heart rate becomes one, and our brains become attuned to those of our companions, and our very breathing synchronizes. And the rhythm in those moments, quite literally, becomes ours. I'll finish with this. Lunch is just around the corner. It was 7 years ago now. I was with a different student group that had followed the Via Podiensis, but that year we were finishing in Roncesvalles. It was late July. My students and I had a meeting in the dining area shortly before bedtime. After that, I ran into one of those hospitaleros in the bathroom. He had seen us meeting and wanted to learn about our experience. I told him about my students, their impressions on walking from La Puya's high schoolers, what they had overcome along the way, and how they were feeling as it came to an end. He was full of praise for me, for the kids, for young people making the pilgrimage at this point in their lives. As he walked away, a thought crossed his mind. He asked me when we would be leaving in the morning. I told him our bus was coming to pick us up and drive us to Bayonne shortly after 6 a.m. He told me that he would be waiting for us. The next morning, we shuffled down the dark hallway on the ground floor, shortly before they turned on the house lights. And sure enough, our hospitalero was there. We huddled around him, and I introduced him to the group. He looked at the students and commended them on what they had done, on their decision to devote such a large part of their summer to such a momentous pursuit. He said that through their journey, they had been in God's hands. They had immersed themselves in a world of beauty and connection. They had ignited a light within that would shine brightly for them as they moved through life. And he called on them to be a light unto others as they returned home, bringing back the lessons of the way. As he did so, he gave each of us one small candle from the church. So ended our pilgrimage, and we walked out to the bus. Those of us who attend a gathering like this, we have resources, of course, but we also have a deep connection to the Camino. and a level of investment that transcends our own individual experience. We carry a light within us, and that serves in part to illuminate our own roads forward. We can choose, though, whether to use that light to blind others with its brilliance, or to help them see why the roads we followed are worth following as well. Because the Camino is not mine or yours. The Camino is ours, and it is theirs. And it is that connection